Welcome to the Sci-Fi Rancher story. Here you find the best HFY story written by human. Listen the story. If you like it, subscribe the channel.
The alien girl was chained over a pit of lava, and I wasn't supposed to save her. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The air on Velkara Prime was thick with heat, the kind that seeped into the bones and made every breath feel like it was being pulled through fire. Even in the safety of the observation platform, high above the jagged cliffs that overlooked the Temple of the Flame, Daniel Reeve could feel the oppressive weight of the atmosphere pressing down on him. The sky was a burnt orange, the horizon a restless blur where the molten rivers of the planet's surface met the thick clouds of volcanic ash. Drifting up from below it was a world that had been shaped by fire, by the kind of brutality that civilizations either adapted to or were consumed by. And from what Daniel had seen so far, the Velkara had done more than adapt. They had built their entire society on the principle of survival through sacrifice. He hadn't wanted to come here. When the United Earth Archaeological Division had received the invitation from the Velkara and high priests to observe one of their sacred rituals, Daniel had been the last person to volunteer for the mission. But he had been chosen regardless, not because he had any particular interest in the temple ceremonies, but because he had studied the Velkara and ruins longer than any of the others on the team. He had spent years piecing together fragments of their history, decoding ancient text that hinted at a lost dynasty, an empire that had once ruled over the fire-plagued world. Before being erased from the records, the high priests, of course, denied any such history, insisting that their rule had been absolute since the dawn of time. And yet, Daniel had found enough evidence to know they were lying. None of that had prepared him for what he was about to witness. The temple stood at the edge of a vast volcanic chasm, its towering obsidian pillars rising like against the sky. Massive chains, each length the size of a man's torso, hung from the upper levels, their ends disappearing into the darkness below where molten lava churned and spat embers into the air. The entire structure was a masterpiece of ancient engineering designed to harness the heat and power of the planet itself. But it was the platform at its center that held Daniel's attention. Suspended over the pit, illuminated by the eerie red glow from below, was the girl. She was bound by heavy shackles at her wrists and ankles, her body stretched taut between two iron beams. Her skin, a deep shade of emerald green, shimmered with a faint sheen of sweat, and despite the impossible heat radiating from the depths below, she didn't struggle. Her head was bowed slightly, long dark hair falling over her face, and Daniel wondered if she had already accepted whatever fate awaited her. But then she lifted her gaze, and he saw the terror in her golden eyes. Something in Daniel's stomach twisted. He had seen executions before, witnessed more than a few societies that still clung to barbaric traditions. But there was something deeply wrong about this. The Velkara had spoken of sacrifice, of offering their chosen to the flame as an honor, but there was no reverence in the way the priests stood in their ceremonial robes, no somber acknowledgement of duty. They were reeving in it. The high priest, a towering figure, draped in robes of crimson and gold, stepped forward, raising his staff above his head. The crowd that had gathered along the temple's lower tier erupted in cheers, their voices merging into a guttural chant that echoed off the stone walls. Daniel clenched his fists. He had been warned not to interfere. The UA's diplomatic protocols were clear. Observers were not permitted to intervene in indigenous rituals, no matter how cruel or inhumane they might seem by Earth's standards. It was one of the first lessons drilled into every archaeology. All IST assigned to interstellar cultural studies. You were there to document, not to judge. But as the high priest turned to address the crowd, his voice booming with words, Daniel only half understood. The chain suspending the girl shifted, the iron groaned, lowering her by mere inches, but it was enough to send a wave of heat washing over her skin. She gasped, her muscles tensing against the restraints, and for a fraction of a second her gaze met Daniel's, panic, desperately Asian, a silent plea. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs. He shouldn't care. He wasn't supposed to care. This wasn't his world, his fight, his responsibility. And yet something inside him rebelled against that cold logic, something primal and undeniable. The girl was going to die. burned alive in the name of a ceremony whose purpose he didn't even fully understand, and everyone around him was going to watch it happen as if it were nothing more than a piece of theater. He could walk away, return to the safety of his ship, file his report, and pretend he had never seen her face, but he knew deep in his gut that if he did, he would never forgive himself. The High Priest's voice rose again, this time in the unmistakable cadence of a final invocation. Whatever was about to happen, it was happening now. Daniel made his decision without another thought. He moved, shoving past the other delegates on the platform, ignoring their startled protests. As he descended the narrow staircase leading to the main floor of the temple, the guards stationed along the path barely had time to react before he was on them, drawing the concealed plasma cutter from his belt. He didn't have a weapon, he hadn't been allowed to carry one, but he had tools, and right now that was enough. He activated the cutter with a sharp hiss, the blue-white blade slicing through the first guard's spear. Before he even had time to register the attack, the second guard lunged, but Daniel was faster. Sidestepping and slamming his elbow into the man's throat, the crowd's chanting faltered, confusion rippling through them. As they realized something was wrong, Daniel didn't stop to think. He sprinted toward the girl, leaping onto the raised platform. Just as the High Priest turned, his expression shifting from smug satisfaction to utter disbelief. "Stop!" the priest bellowed, his voice cutting through the noise. Daniel ignored him. He reached the girl's side, gripping the shackles at her wrists, and activated the plasma cutter. Again the metal hissed and gave way, the restraint snapping open. The girl sagged against him, her body trembling, and he wasted no time cutting the remaining chains at her ankles. He could hear the guards closing in, the sound of heavy footsteps pounding against the stone. They weren't going to let him leave. He had seconds, maybe less. "Hold on," he muttered, wrapping an arm around her waist. She didn't resist. If anything, she clung to him, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. Then he jumped the platform's edge, rushed toward him, the sheer drove into the chasm, a blur of molten red and black shadows. His free hand shot to the grappling device at his belt, fingers tightening over the trigger. A split second later, the cable fired, the sharp hook catching onto one of the temple's overhanging support beams. The jolt of impact nearly ripped his arm from its socket, but he held on, swinging, eyeing them both away from the temple's platform. Just as the first bolts of energy fire erupted behind them, the last thing he heard before they disappeared into the smoke-filled sky was the furious roar of the High Priest, followed by the thunderous cheers of the crowd below, and then the world was nothing but fire and falling ash. The moment they swung away from the temple, the weight of what he had done began to sink into Daniel like a leaden stone in his chest. The heat from the molten lava below still radiated through the thick air, searing his lungs with every breath. But there was no time to think about it. The grappling hook held firm against the temple's overhanging support beam, and he used the momentum to shift their trajectory, angling them toward one of the jagged rock formations jutting out from the cliffside. The girl clung to him, her grip so tight he could feel the tremor in her muscles, her body still weakened from whatever hell they had put her through before he had intervened. Her breathing was ragged, uneven, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered. The moment his boots hit solid ground, he released the grappling hook, disengaging the line before pulling her forward. She stumbled, her legs nearly giving out, but he caught her before she could collapse completely. Up close, she looked even worse than she had from the temple's platform. Her green skin was marred with bruises, dark smudges along her wrists where the shackles had cut into her flesh, her golden eyes still hazy with exhaustion. He didn't know what they had done to her before they strung her up over the lava, but he could guess. He had read enough about sacrificial rituals in his studies to know that she had likely been weakened on purpose, drained of energy, so she wouldn't struggle when the time came. "Can you run?" he asked, his voice lower than he intended, his mind already calculating their next move. They had only bought themselves seconds, maybe a minute at best. The temple guards wouldn't just let them escape. He could already hear the alarms echoing from above, the shouts of the High Priest, furious and commanding, demanding pursuit. They would be coming, and they wouldn't stop until they had her back, or until he was dead. She blinked up at him, her expression still caught somewhere between disbelief and weariness. For a second he thought she might not answer, but then she swallowed hard and nodded. "I think so," she rasped, her voice horror as if she hadn't spoken in days. Where are we going? Anywhere. That's not here, he said, tightening his grip on her arm. Before pulling her forward, the terrain was a nightmare to traverse. Sharp obsidian rocks jutting up from the scorched ground, rivers of molten lava cutting through the land like glowing veins. The heat was suffocating, sweat already beading along his brow as he led them into the craggy wasteland. Stretching beyond the temple's cliffs, sighed the Velen, called this region the burning expanse, an inhospitable wasteland where only the most desperate or foolish dared to tread. Unfortunately, right now he and the girl fit both categories. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing louder. He could hear the clatter of boots against stone, the sharp hum of energy weapons charging. They were fast, too fast. Damn it, Daniel muttered under his breath, scanning their surroundings for anything, any possible way to lose them. But there was nothing but blackened rock and molten chasms. No cover, no natural formations to hide behind. The only real chance they had was distance. But the girl was still sluggish, her movements clumsy with exhaustion. She wasn't going to last long at this pace. She must have sensed his frustration, because she suddenly pulled away from him, stopping so abruptly that he nearly stumbled forward. He turned sharply, ready to snap at her to keep moving, but something in her expression froze the words in his throat. She was staring at him with something new in her gaze, not fear, not exhaustion, but determination. I can't run fast enough, she said, her breath still uneven but steadier now. But I can boost time. His brow furrowed. What? Before he could finish, she turned toward the approaching temple guards, her posture shifting, her shoulders squaring, as if she had found some last reserve of strength buried beneath her fatigue. She lifted one hand. Fingers sped, and then suddenly the air around them changed. The temperature spiked, not from the lava, not from the environment, but from her. He felt it like a wave crashing through the air, something ancient and powerful, something wrong. And then he saw it, the golden energy sparking to life along her fingertips, flickering like embers before bursting outward in a sudden pulse. The effect was immediate. The temple guard, still several meters away, had halted mid-charge, their weapons raised, but suddenly unsteady. One of them shouted something in Velar, a sharp, panicked exclamation that Daniel couldn't fully translate, but he understood the meaning well enough. Fear. The energy surrounding her pulsed again, brighter this time, casting sharp golden light against the jagged rocks around them. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, it faded, leaving only the heavy silence in its wake. The guards hesitated for a moment. It looked as if they were about to push forward again, but then one of them turned sharply on his heel and bolted back toward the temple, a warning, no doubt a message to the high priest that the girl had done something. Daniel exhaled, his own heart pounding, though not from the chase anymore. He turned back to the girl, searching her expression, but she looked just as confused as the guards had. She glanced down at her hands, flexing her fingers, as if she didn't quite understand what had just happened. You want to explain that? He asked. She looked up at him, golden eyes filled with something between uncertainty and dawning realization. I don't know, she admitted. I shouldn't be able to do that, not anymore. He frowned but didn't press. They didn't have time to figure it out now. Whatever had just happened, it had bought them a window, however brief. They needed to move before the guards regrouped. Come on, he said, motioning her forward. They pressed deeper into the wastelands, navigating the treacherous ground as fast as they could manage. The further they got from the temple, the more the air began to shift, the volcanic heat giving way to something more tolerable, though the landscape remained just as harsh. Daniel kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting another squad of guards to appear at any moment. But for now they were alone. As they walked, the girl's breathing evened out, and she finally spoke again. You shouldn't have saved me. Daniel glanced at her, his jaw tightening. Yeah, well, it's a little late for that now. She exhaled a short, humorless laugh. They're going to hunt you. Hunt us? He nodded. I figured. Another pause, then quieter. She said, you don't even know who I am. He looked at her again, something unreadable passing between them. Not yet. She studied him for a long moment, and for the first time since he had cut her change, she looked less like a victim and more like something else entirely, someone who had just woken up from a long-forced slumber. You will, she murmured. Daniel didn't respond. He only looked ahead to the endless stretch of unforgiving land that lay before them, and to whatever came next, the wasteland stretched before them. An unforgiving expanse of jagged volcanic rock and shifting waves of heat that made the air itself seem alive with shimmering mirages. Daniel could already feel the ache settling into his muscles. The strain of running, climbing, and dodging their pursuers taking its toll, but he pushed forward, keeping his pace, steady, adjusting his grip on Sey'ra's arm. Whenever she stumbled, she was regaining her strength, but it was slow, too slow, and every second they lost was a second closer to death. He could still hear the distant echoes of alarms from the temple behind them, the guttural shouts of the Velkara and priests rallying their forces. He knew they weren't safe. Not yet. Sey'ra's breathing had evened out somewhat, though there was still a ragged edge to it. She hadn't spoken again since her quiet, almost eerie declaration that he would soon learn who she was. The words still lingered in his mind, circling like vultures, picking apart his understanding of the situation. He had seen something back there, something in the way the guards had reacted when she had lashed out with that strange pulse of energy. The fear in her eyes hadn't been simple superstition, it had been recognition. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, watching the way her golden gaze flicked wearily over their surroundings, the way she carried herself now that the immediate shock of escape had worn off. She was still weak, still recovering, but there was a strength there buried beneath the exhaustion and bruises. She didn't move like a helpless captive. She moved like someone who had once known how to fight. Daniel knew better than to push her for answers. She would tell him when she was ready, or not at all. Either way, he had already thrown his lot in with hers, whether he liked it or not. The ground beneath them trembled slightly, a distant quake rumbling through the volcanic veins of the planet. Daniel slowed, narrowing his eyes as he scanned the horizon. The terrain ahead sloped downward, leading into a series of jagged ravines, fissures in the earth, where molten rock flowed in slow, seething rivers. It was dangerous territory, but it was also their best chance at losing anyone still tracking them this way, he said, nodding toward the descent. Sey'ra hesitated. The lava tunnels, she murmured, her voice carrying a note of unease. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You know them, she exhaled, brushing a strand of dark hair away from her face. I've heard stories. The Velkaran priests call them the path of the forsaken exiles who defy the temple are cast into the tunnels. None ever return, Daniel huffed, adjusting the strap of his gear pack. Sounds like exactly where we need to be. She didn't argue, just cast one last glance over her shoulder before following him down the rocky slope. The air thickened the deeper they went, the scent of sulfur clinging to everything, making it difficult to breathe. The heat was relentless, waves of it rolling off the lava streams, forcing them to keep their distance from the edges. The terrain was uneven, loose stones shifting beneath their feet with every step, forcing them to move carefully as they pressed forward. The walls of the ravine closed in around them, rising high on either side like the jagged ribs of some long-dead beast. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, the sounds of pursuit fading behind them, until all that remained was the low, distant murmur of the molten rivers and the occasional crack of rocks splitting under the intense heat. It should have felt like a relief, but it didn't. Sey'ra was tense, her gaze darting toward every shadow, every crevice, where something might be lurking. Daniel didn't dismiss her unease. The story she had mentioned about exiles never returning felt uncomfortably able now that they were inside the tunnels themselves. The terrain was harsh enough to kill anyone unprepared for it. But that wasn't the real danger. The real danger was what might already be down here. They moved in silence for a while, navigating the treacherous path, stepping carefully over unstable ground and avoiding the worst of the heat. Every so often Sey'ra would pause, tilting her head as if listening for something, her golden eyes narrowing in concentration. Finally, Daniel had enough. You keep looking around like we're about to be eaten. You want to tell me what exactly I should be watching out for? She hesitated before answering. The forsaken. Daniel frowned. I thought they were just people exiled by the temple. They were, she said. Once, but the heat down here, it does things. There are stories of those who have survived, those who refuse to die in the flames. The priests say they were twisted by the fire, changed into something else, something hungry. Daniel exhaled sharply. Great, so now we're running from fanatical priests and fire. Newtons. She shot him a look, and for the first time since their escape, Something close to amusement flickered across her face. "You're surprisingly calm about this." He gave her a wry smirk. "I've had worse days." She didn't press, but he could feel her studying him the way her gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary before she turned forward again. They continued moving, but now Daniel was even more alert, scanning their surroundings for any sign of movement. The deeper they went, the more unsettling the silence became. It wasn't just the absence of pursuit, it was something else, something just on the edge of perception, like a presence lurking just beyond sight. Then, without warning, Sey'ra stopped. Daniel barely had time to react before she grabbed his arm, pulling him down behind a jagged outcrop of stone. He opened his mouth to question her, but she pressed a finger to her lips, her eyes sharp with warning. He followed her gaze toward the path ahead. At first, he saw nothing, just more rock, more tunnels, more of the same infernal heat that had been suffocating them since they entered this place. Then, movement. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping onto the narrow ledge just above the molten river. At first glance, it looked human or close to it, but as it moved, Daniel saw the way its skin glowed faintly, cracks of ember like light running through its flesh like molten veins. Its eyes burned with an unnatural intensity, and when it turned its head slightly, Daniel caught a glimpse of what remained of a face, once Velkara, once something recognizable, now something wholly unnatural. It was hunting. Daniel kept his breathing steady, lowering himself further behind the rock, feeling Sey'ra shift beside him. He didn't know if the thing could hear them, but he wasn't about to take any chances. He met her gaze silently, asking now what. She exhaled slowly, then mouthed, "Wait." The creature lingered, its head tilting slightly as if sniffing the air. Daniel could see the heat rising from its skin, the way its fingers flexed sharp and claw-like. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and continued down the path, vanishing into the haze. They remained still for several more moments before Sey'ra finally released the breath she had been holding. "We need to move," she whispered. Daniel nodded, his mind already racing. The temple guards were no longer the worst of their problems. They weren't alone in the tunnels, and whatever was down here with them had already caught their scent. The silence that followed was oppressive, the weight of the encounter pressing down on them as they remained crouched behind the jagged outcrop of volcanic rock. Daniel could still see the afterimage of the creature's ember-lit form burned into his vision. The way it had moved, fluid but unnatural, the eerie glow of its veins pulsating as if the fire beneath its skin was barely contained. Whatever it had been once, Velkara exile victim, it wasn't that anymore. And the way it had sniffed the air, the deliberate slowness of its steps, the way its head had tilted in their direction before it moved on, told him one thing with absolute certainty: it knew they were here. Sey'ra's grip on his arm had loosened, but she hadn't let go entirely. Her fingers still curled tightly against the fabric of his sleeve, as if anchoring herself. When she finally exhaled, it was a slow, controlled breath. Her golden eyes locked onto the space where the creature had disappeared. Daniel didn't move right away. He wanted to. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to get out of here before that thing or others like it came back. But rushing and blind was a sure way to get themselves killed. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to barely above a whisper. "You've seen one of those before, haven't you?" Sey'ra's gaze flickered to him, and for a moment she didn't answer. When she finally did, her voice was barely audible. "Not in person, but I know what they are." Daniel resisted the urge to sigh. He had expected as much. She had spoken of the Forsaken before, of the stories surrounding them, but stories rarely prepared anyone for the reality of monsters was lurking in the dark. He had learned it the hard way more than once in his line of work. Are they always alone? He asked, his mind already calculating their chances. If another one of those things was still nearby. No, the way she said it sent a chill through him. They hunt in packs, but that one, it was different. Daniel narrowed his eyes. How she hesitated, shifting her weight slightly, her expression unreadable. It was looking for something. It wasn't just wandering. His jaw clenched. He didn't like the implications of that. If these things hunted in packs, but one had broken off to search alone, then it had a reason, a purpose. And the way it had lingered, the way it had smelled the air. "We need to move," he said, finally breaking the stifling stillness. Sey'ra nodded, already adjusting her stance, though he could still see the slight unsteadiness in her movements. She was regaining her strength, but the temple's torture and the suffocating heat of these tunnels had drained her. He doubted she would admit it, but she wasn't at full capacity. And if they had to fight one of those things or more, he needed to be prepared for the worst. They moved carefully, keeping close to the rock walls where the jagged shadows provided some cover. Daniel kept his hand near his belt, where his plasma cutter was holstered. It wasn't a weapon, not really, but it was the only thing he had that could slice through metal. And he wasn't about to test whether it could do the same to flesh that burned like embers. The tunnel sloped downward, the path narrowing between the sharp walls. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to thicken, not just with heat, but with something else, something heavier, something that made the skin on the back of his neck prickle. Sey'ra must have felt it too, because she suddenly stopped, her body going rigid, her breath catching in her throat. Daniel was about to ask what she had sensed when he heard it, a low, wet, clicking sound barely audible over the ambient hum of the molten rivers nearby. It was rhythmic, almost methodical, like something tapping against the stone, and it was coming from just ahead of them. He reacted on instinct, grabbing Sey'ra's wrist and pulling her back, pressing them both against the wall. The dim light from the lava cast erratic shadows against the tunnel's jagged edges, and for a moment he wasn't sure if he was imagining it. Then, just barely visible against the darkened tunnel ahead, he saw the shape moving. It was larger than the one they had seen before. The glow of its molten veins was stronger, pooling with a sickly rhythmic light. But it wasn't the size or the glow that made Daniel's pulse quicken. It was the others behind it. 3, maybe 4 more, shifting through the haze, their glowing eyes flickering like embers in the dark. They weren't searching anymore. They had found them. Sey'ra tense beside him, her breath shallow, her body coiled like a spring, ready to snap. Daniel barely had time to process what was happening before the lead creature took a slow step forward. Then, with a sharp, choked exhale, Sey'ra grabbed his arm and ran. He didn't hesitate. There was no time to think, no time to strategize. The creatures let out a guttural, unearthly sound, half a snarl, half a wail. As they surged forward, Daniel felt the heat of them against back as they sprinted down the narrowing passageway, the ground trembling beneath their feet. Faster, Sey'ra gasped, her voice sharp with urgency. Daniel pushed himself harder, his muscles burning from exertion. The path ahead was uneven, broken stone jutting up in jagged formations. The tunnel twisted sharply, and without slowing, Sey'ra pulled him hard to the left, yanking them into a narrow crevice. Just as the creatures barreled past, their glowing forms streaking by in a blur of molten light, they pressed themselves against the rock, barely breathing, as the creatures skidded to a stop just ahead, their glowing eyes darting around the cavern. Daniel could hear the clicking again, a strange, almost irritated sound. Then one of them turned the moment its burning gaze locked onto them. Sey'ra moved. She didn't run this time. She lunged, her hand shot up, fingers spade, and that golden energy, wild, crackling, ancient, exploded outward. The tunnel was bathed in sudden light, the force of it sending the lead creature staggering back. The others shrieked, their ember-lit bodies reacting violently to the blast. Daniel didn't know what she had done. He didn't have time to care. Geo, he shouted, grabbing her and shoving forward. They sprinted through the tunnel as the creatures reeled from the shock wave, their enraged wails echoing behind. Then the path opened ahead, widening into what looked like another chamber. But Daniel didn't slow. Sey'ra stumbled, but kept pace, her body still trembling from whatever power she had unleashed. They weren't safe, not yet, but as they bolted into the cavern, Daniel knew one thing for certain: the creatures weren't the only ones hunting now, and whatever Sey'ra had just done, whatever power she had tapped into, it was waking up. The chamber they had stumbled into was vast and ancient, hollow, carved into the volcanic rock, its ceiling lost in the swirling haze of heat, and ash streaks of molten light cut through the darkness, dripping from the walls like veins of fire, illuminating the space in a hellish glow. Daniel barely had time to process the sheer scale of it before Sey'ra collapsed against him, her body trembling, her breath ragged. He caught her, instinctively gripping her shoulders as she sagged forward, her weight pressing into him. Her skin was hot beneath his hands, almost feverish, as if whatever energy she had unleashed had burned through her from the inside. He lowered her carefully onto a flat stretch of stone, his pulse still hammering in his ears. The creatures were still out there, still hunting, but for the moment the only sounds in the chamber were the distant gurgling of molten rock and the unsteady rhythm of Sey'ra's breathing. She looked exhausted, drained in a way that went beyond mere physical fatigue. He had seen the way that golden light had erupted from her, had felt the shock wave of it pulse through the air like a living force. He didn't know what it was, but it had stopped the creatures, at least temporarily. What the hell was that, he asked, keeping his voice low but urgent. Sey'ra didn't respond right away. She blinked slowly, her golden eyes unfocused, her chest rising and falling unevenly. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, weaker. I don't know. Her brows furrowed as if she was struggling to make sense of it herself. I shouldn't be able to do that, not anymore. Daniel exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his sweat dampened hair. He had no idea what to make of any of this. He had come to Velkara Prime expecting to observe an ancient ritual, not to be running for his life through a labyrinth of fire, chased by molten creatures alongside a girl who could apparently summon bursts of energy out of nowhere, and yet here they were. He pushed aside the questions gnawing at his mind, and focused on the immediate problem. "Can you move?" he asked, watching her carefully. Sey'ra nodded, but didn't look convinced. She braced her hands against the stone, pushing herself upright with visible effort. He reached out instinctively to steady her, but she waved him off, exhaling through gritted teeth, "I'm fine," she muttered, though the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her. Daniel didn't argue. They didn't have time for arguments. He turned his attention to the chamber, scanning the bagged walls for any sign of another way out. The creatures, they had to assume more than just the ones they had seen were down here, would be hunting them. He doubted Sey'ra's power surge had killed them. If anything, it had probably only made them more determined. The only path forward was a narrow tunnel on the far end of the chamber, its entrance framed by long curving stalactites that glowed faintly with an eerie bioluminescent shimmer. It was strange. The molten rivers and oppressive heat had been constant in the tunnels before, but something about this place felt different. The air was thick, but not just with heat. It was charged like the moment before a storm. "We need to keep moving," he said, glancing at Sey'ra. "Can you make it to that passage?" She followed his gaze, studying the tunnel before nodding yes. Daniel didn't hesitate. He helped her to her feet, making sure she was steady before leading the way. Every step they took felt like it echoed in the cavern, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the heat haze. The tunnel beyond the chamber sloped downward, its walls narrowing, forcing them to move carefully, keeping close to the jagged rock. The glow from the chamber behind them faded, replaced by deeper darkness, the only illumination coming from strange, faintly luminescent growths that clung to the walls in irregular patches. Sey'ra reached out, brushing her fingertips lightly against one of the glowing strands. The light flickered under her touch, responding as if it recognized her. She frowned, pulling her hand back. "This isn't natural." Daniel eyed the strange formations. He had seen plenty of alien ecosystems, plenty of strange phenomena that defied immediate explanation. But there was something unsettling about this place. It felt old, not just in the way that ruins felt old, but in a way that spoke of something ancient, something buried beneath layers of history and forgotten for a reason. They moved deeper, the tunnel winding into a vast subterranean chasm. At first glance, it appeared to be another natural formation, but as they descended, Daniel started noticing the details that told him otherwise. The walls weren't just rock. They were shaped, smoothed in places where no natural erosion could have done the work. Patterns were etched into the stone, faint symbols barely visible beneath centuries of accumulated mineral deposits. This wasn't just a tunnel, it was a ruin. Sey'ra stopped beside him, her eyes widening as she took it all in. This, she whispered, this was a city. Daniel's stomach tightened. He had suspected as much, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real. The Velkara temple had always denied the existence of a civilization. Before their rule, they claimed the current priesthood had been in power since time immemorial, but Daniel had seen enough fragmented records to know that was a lie. Something had existed before them, and now, standing here deep beneath the surface of this cursed world, he was looking at the proof. Sey'ra moved ahead, running her hands over the carved patterns in the stone. Her expression had shifted from exhaustion to something else, recognition. "I've seen these before," she murmured, "in the temple's forbidden archives these symbols. They belonged to the first blood. Daniel's pulse quickened. The first blood, he had encountered references to them in the scattered remnants of Velkara and history vague. Allusions to a lost dynasty, a forgotten lineage that predated the priesthood's rule, but the details had always been deliberately erased, twisted into myth. What happened to them? He asked. Seyra's gaze darkened. They were purged, their existence erased. The high priest's build